when we started with the open-weight LLMs here internally about a year ago, we were browsing the internet for IDE plugin. And so we got in contact then with Ty and Nate from ContinuDev, and I'm super happy that you're joining us today. Welcome, Ty.
Thank you, Roger. Hello, everybody. So I do recognize I am the last talk, and it's been a long day. It's been an awesome day, but it's been long, so I'll try and be simple and concise and maybe leave extra time for questions, and if we don't have questions, we can all go to the bar and the barbecue and hang out. So as Roger mentioned, I'm with Continue. I'm one of the co-founders, and today we're going to talk about an open architecture for AI native development. And so the goals for this talk are to just describe one of many possible open architectures. I think given how fast the AI space is moving, it's not clear to me that anyone today could describe what the architecture of kind of software development is going to look like in the future, but my hope is it's open and that I think today you can start to describe some examples. It might not be the example, and so I will attempt to do that. And the reason for doing that is I hope I can inspire you to think more deeply about what do we want the future of software development to look like, and how do we want it to work, right? I think a lot of folks would agree that it's changing, but I think I too often see people not expressing that they have some choice in helping shape it, right? The collective of software engineers will really decide what and where we go. And so very quickly, I'll answer a couple questions in case you're brand new. What is Continue? As Roger mentioned, it's an open source IDE extension, so it's currently in VS Code and JetBrains, and we're in alpha with a CLI that you would also be able to use in other editors and other IDEs. And then we're not going to talk about it a lot today, but we also have a hub of rules, tools, and models where you can actually create, share, and use custom AI code assistants. And so there'll be a way in which we talk about both of these, but it's going to be kind of more in a conceptual fashion. And so then the next question is probably, what is AI native development? So Andrej Karpathy, one of the great deep learning researchers, is the person who coined the word vibe coding, which you might be more familiar with. And it's kind of taken a life of its own, but the original kind of meaning of it was, hey, use language models, use foundation models while coding, and don't look at the diff, just hit accept, and don't care about the code, and it's really great for side projects and weekend things and stuff like that. And he then followed up a little bit later and was like, hey, y'all, like, not all coding with AI is vibe coding, and he used the word AI-assisted coding. I'm using the word AI native development today. I think ultimately it'll just be called coding or development. But here, it's very much you're actually building software that you care about, that you want to be high quality in a professional setting. So he gives the example of he tries to stuff everything relevant into the context window as much as possible. He describes the next single incremental change that he wants, and he doesn't go right into implementation. Instead, with that large language model, he actually has a discussion about different high-level approaches. He then kind of goes potentially even further, making it concrete, and then he picks one, has it draft the code for it, reviews it manually, and kind of with the time he saves, he uses that as the opportunity to go look at the API docs and really understand and make sure every single part of the code that he will be responsible for shipping is something that he understands and is giving a thumbs up to. Then he does a little bit of testing and Git commits it. And so that's a very abstract example. I'll give another example of what I see in many of the Continue power users. So usually they start with agent mode, where they're asking the model to do a task, and they ask themselves, okay, given the model I'm using and the task I'm trying to do I think that the agent is kind of the thing to do the inner loop, and I'm just the person that's going to review it? And so in this case, I'm just asking, like, find the key value cache in the code base, and that's definitely a task that the model can do, where you're like, hey, implement an entire web app from scratch, VLM from scratch, right? It probably can't do that today. And so if agent can't do it, then what I see people do is they then kind of go to a chat mode where they are kind of the person really driving the inner loop, and they're deciding when they bring the model in, right? To ask questions about how the code works and iterate on the code with the model. And then if that isn't quite the right abstraction to work at, if they need to be deeper into the code, they'll move into the edit mode where they're transforming a code section. So here I'm just highlighting a code with terrible variable names and saying, make these human readable. So it's kind of like a find and replace, but leveraging some of the model reasoning capabilities. And then You have autocomplete, where if you really need to get into the code and you're the one writing it, in some cases, depending on the situation, the model might be able to complete a line or two for you. And then AI native development, in my opinion, still includes good old-fashioned writing the code manually, because there's many places where it's just far easier to type the code than try and explain it in German or English or whatever natural language you speak. And so now we get into the topic of the AI native open architecture. Now that I've given a little bit about Continue and a little bit about AI native development and what that looks like. And so I thought Craig McLuckie, one of the co-founders of Kubernetes and CNCF, and most recently Stacklock, at the O'Reilly AI Code Con had two really great slides that I'm going to borrow here. It's all about tipping AI code generation on its side. And so he kind of characterizes a lot of the tools that you may be using or are excited about today as vertically integrated solutions, where they select the LLM for you, they handle all the context management, they do all the workflow logic, they package it up in an app, and it's really frictionless and convenient, right? You just plug your credit card in and it just works, right? And that many of those folks fit into that kind of paradigm. What we're starting to see, and when I talked to Roger and the team last year, right, Siemens was at the forefront of this, is this emerging horizontally aligned system where you're kind of decoupling the layers, so you have many LLMs running in different locations you can use, and then you have resource access, middleware, and orchestration on top of it. And the reason for this is that the vertically integrated solutions, while they're great to get started, they're closed and opaque. They're kind of subject to disruption. That's why you're seeing a new tool come out that becomes the hot one that everyone is excited about. And you're kind of very much outsourcing your trust, right? Because your data is going to them. You don't know what models they're really using, a lot of those things. Where in a horizontally aligned system, it's open and modular, so you can invite the entire community, whether it's inner source in a company or open source with the entire world, to work together to actually make the AI code assistance and the horizontally aligned system better. And so in our point of view, or in Craig's and mine, it promotes developer agency. And so the architecture we're going to look at today hopefully won't overwhelm you, but we're going to go through every single part of it and just kind of chat about one single example, right? I have a feeling this is not going to be the one that ends up the one in the end. So the first thing that I want to focus on is like this layer here, where you have the open source VS Code extension client, you have an open source JetBrains plugin client, an open source CLI client, other custom clients that might not be open source, so they might be tools or non-open source things that you then plug your kind of horizontally aligned system, your open architecture into. And I think there could be other open source, like open source NeoVim plugin or open source Vim plugin. And so I think kind of the future is allowing your system to actually find its way into a lot of the software development lifecycle and be kind of involved at every step of the way. And so when we look at the open source clients, right, I mentioned some of them, but I think the main benefits, you're like, why does it need to be open source? I think the first and foremost, when you use it, you can actually go deeply understand how it works because it's transparent. And I think that's really important for tools, especially if it's a tool you're using as often as you use an AI code assistant, where you can actually learn like, oh, how does this technology work? How can I better leverage it? Where are the places I should do things manually? Where are the ways in which this goes wrong? The second one is like, I think it's often critical for an ecosystem to build on top of it and around it, right? So a good example would be like Git, right? If Git was an open source, we probably wouldn't have had GitHub and GitLab and the CI/CD frameworks and all of those things that ended up building on top of kind of Git-based workflows come because what it says to everybody in the ecosystem, whether they're building open source things or not, right, that they can bet on this, that this is permissively licensed. And in the very worst case scenario, the community could fork and continue on if that whoever's the maintainers decided to not have it be a foundational piece for whatever reason. And then lastly, this is the kick I've been on for 2 years, and it's starting to become more known and more critical among developers, is that you get to keep and leverage your development data. So we'll go through what development data is, but in my view, it's probably the most important intellectual property of the coming decades, especially for organizations, and especially for developers, right? Like this is how you build software, and it's the very data that the AI labs need to train better and better code models. And so when you're using many tools where you're not sure where the data is going or what your rights are to it, they're actually using that data to make things better on average for all developers who use those tools. And which one is not great for you, but also limits what it's possible, right? So you're not going to be able to actually take your data and tailor it to you or your company. And then on the custom client side, I think this probably ends up looking like a SDK API that lets you pull in what we'll talk about, the rules, models, and tools, so that you can do automation throughout the software development lifecycle. So a lot of what people call agents I've boiled down to is rules, tools, models in a loop. And so Airbnb had a really good example recently where they actually went from Enzyme, React testing framework, to RTL, I think it's called React Testing Library, and they used large language models in the process. And so they had some rules, some prompts, they had some tools. I don't know if they were MCP servers or what, I'll have to double check. And then they obviously had models, right? And they put them in a loop. And so what they were able to do is they were able, and I think that's actually probably a good rule of thumb, is that in a few days or in a few hours with this system they built, they were able to automate about 75% of the migration process. And so they had 25% of things that didn't work in the beginning when they first set up the system with the initial prompts. And so they reviewed things, they built kind of this loop here where they were trying retries and dynamically generating prompts and all of those things. And that took about 4 days, and that got them to 97% without having to actually look at things, where they were able to migrate those tests over. And then the last 97% took about a few weeks because they had to do them manually, right? So they had 3,500 tests, and they managed to only have to do about 100 manually. And LLMs got them pretty close, right? 75% one shot, and then the last 25% was really, or took a few days, right? And then, or the last 22% took a few days, and the last 3% took a couple weeks. So I think you'll find that with these models, they're really good, but the thing about coding is 75% isn't good enough, right? 97% isn't good enough. Like, you have to, if you're going to migrate to a new test framework, you got to migrate everything. And so that's kind of the clients that are open source and custom, so that you can plug in the system. Next, we're going to talk about probably the most critical piece, the models, right? And so we just had a great talk from Red Hat on using VLLM. So data center, it was super cool to hear that Siemens has their own data center where they're running VLLM. Qwen 2.5 Coder is something you could run there. And then we have lots of folks in enterprises using like AWS Bedrock, OpenAI Azure Service, AI Foundry on Azure, and GCP Vertex. And that's where they can access the best models and still have some guarantees around where their data is going and how it's being used and stuff like that, so they can keep it in their virtual private cloud. And then lastly, the models that can run locally are getting good enough. So like Gemma 3, you could run it with something like Ollama or Llama CPP or LM Studio. And the cool thing about kind of the open architecture is you get to have some choice around what models you're using and where they're running. And so models are the intelligence that allows you to basically use rules and tools to automate tasks. And so they give you the reasoning and kind of tool capabilities. And what we're kind of seeing in the last, I mean, I've been in this space for a long time, so I was like one of the first people to use GPT-2. So I've seen the progress, and from my point of view, I see kind of 5 key model trends going on. So the first one is probably obvious to everyone, like the models are getting better and better. And then what I hope is happening and seems to be happening is not only are the models getting better, but the open models are months or at most maybe a year behind, couple of years behind the very best frontier models. And so you have those 2 pieces going on. And then you also have improved economics, right? With quantization, you can get the model smaller. Just in general, the models seem to get much, much better in time, right? I think like the small, if I remember correctly, the large Llama 2 was worse than the small Llama 3 when it came out. And I think we're seeing that trend happen, right? Where the models are getting cheaper, faster, and more capable, which means you can run them on cheaper compute, and you're able to actually not have to spend a fortune on energy or on API tokens. And then what we're seeing, at least in the AI code assistant space, is it's not like a single model. It's not like you're using Claude Force on it for everything. So I think Continue, I can speak to that. Many of the other AI code assistants are similar. It's somewhere between actually 5 and 7 models under the hood that do different tasks, and that you can actually get benefits of for particular tasks where latency matters more. So autocomplete matters more with latency. So you generally would use a smaller model. It needs to be trained for something called fill in the middle. And so the large models generally aren't trained for that. And so if you build a specialization there, you can actually leverage a cheaper, faster model that's just as good as if you used a bigger, slower model. And then growing domain specialization. So especially with open models, some amount of API-based models, you're able to actually fit them into your patterns, your organization's idioms, like maybe niche programming languages or programming languages that haven't seen the light of day. And so those are the things I'm seeing, and in some ways they feel like some of them are even speeding up. And the part that I was hitting on earlier, right, is the nice thing about the open architecture approach is you can actually distribute across compute environments, and so you're able to balance security, cost, and performance, and able to say, hey, these models are good enough for this task, right, where I'm going to just use them directly on our machines that have a M4 because they're MacBooks, right, and it's really nice because it's low latency. You're not having to go to the network and back. And then in places where you do have GPUs, you can actually self-host your own models that are able to be fine-tuned, and you can deploy them behind your firewalls. Your data never leaves your environment. You know exactly where it's going and how it's being used. And lastly, the VPC deployment. So you can use the cloud models, but maintain data sovereignty, where you can say, hey, I want to use AWS Bedrock, but only in Europe, right? And your data never leaves the continent. And so the next up is rules. This seems to be an emerging thing across all of the AI code assistants. And so what I'm showing here on the architecture is that there are some rules that apply to many code bases. And so the simple thing that I see people starting with is they end up creating a Git repo for rules that go across the code base. So examples would be like standards for how we code in general in our organization, standards for how we code in Go or Rust or things like that. But then also other idioms and practices like, oh, we're a clean code shop, right? And so we make our rules for being clean. And so rules are used to describe basically different intents, constraints, policies, specifications. I think they're largely just going to be natural language. So like probably Markdown, and then maybe some like YAML front matter with triggers, right? Because you're going to end up having too many rules that trying to stuff them all into context windows is going to be too challenging. So you could say like, oh, only apply this rule when I'm in a TypeScript file, right? Or only when I import this Python library, apply this rule, so that you can manage like what you're putting into the context window. But I do think that you're going to need to like think about them in terms of types, because it will help you to kind of create the right kind of rules. So something like intents would be like workflows or whatever, where you kind of explain how you like to do some tasks. Constraints would be, hey, of the possible solutions you could come up with, like, can we actually narrow that down and say like, hey, it has to be within 100 milliseconds response time. It can only use this much memory. And like those kind of things really help the model to know what the solution should look like. Policies would just be kind of what is the business logic? Is it their security like requirements or GDPR concerns or different things like that? Kind of the edge cases that are required for software to be shipped in your organization. Specifications, I think, most people would be familiar with. And so I think that collectively, if you think about what all these rules are, is they're natural language descriptions about how you make software. And by creating them, you make kind of your software development process legible so that the models are able to actually leverage it when they come up with a solution, but also accessible in the form of tools, right, where they can actually go and take an action or go retrieve data, because that's a critical part of the software development process. And so, like I mentioned, some rules are often stored with the code base. If they're very code base specific, you can just put them. I think thinking about them like almost like tests is really a good way to put it, is like sometimes you'll co-locate them in the same directory, other times you'll have all of the rules across the entire code base, and you'll use triggers or glob patterns to make sure that like only rules fire in certain scenarios. While the ones that seem to be crossing code bases are kind of being put into another Git repository, but as we'll talk about with the open server here in a second, I think that a Git repository is not going to be the ultimate place for these things. And so MCP server with tools to interact with Sentry is kind of the next part of this example, open architecture. And so the models need to be able to basically retrieve information in real time. So like if you're using Jira or Confluence or Linear, right, to be able to go grab those tickets and have those in mind when it makes a suggestion, when it offers code to you. But then also the other thing, right, being able to take action so that they can validate their code changes, they can update database schemas based on the code modifications, they can edit files in the development environment, and so you need to be able to give them tools. And what we're finding is often people are packaging them in MCP servers, so Model Context Protocol, though not all tools I don't think will ultimately be there. It's a very convenient thing today, but I think tools will go beyond MCP. And then lastly, there's two more. Second to last before we talk about the open server would be MinIO storage for development data. And so development data is the how of software development. So it's what happens in between Git commits. And so it's the step-by-step process of software creation. And so it's the patterns that make your organization unique. It's what context you're pulling in to decide why you do what step instead of another step. And then it's the reasoning behind your implementation choice. And the part that I think not enough people realize is that by using models while you're coding, you're revealing a lot of this data, right? And that's what I'm calling development data here. And that data is the very data that models are being used. Like, a lot of what's happening right now with the labs is they're paying software developers in their free time to offer kind of code reasoning that's independent of real world enterprise environments, because most enterprises don't want to give them that data. And so like if you've seen kind of the reasoning capabilities improve quite a bit, if you've seen kind of how good the models have gotten at coding, that's primarily because these reasoning traces are now being used, especially in the post-training process, but in some cases in the pre-training process. And so if you think about how do we get to very, very capable models, it's about leveraging the coding that y'all are doing and that I'm doing every day, right? And so I think the question is, how do we want that data to be used? Who has the right to use it? Where do you store it? Those kind of things. And so what basically you're able to do is you're able to, through that kind of process, what today is generally implicit, it's tribal knowledge, it's stuff that y'all share amongst each other, it's often stored in your head or in disparate places where you know to go find it. That implicit knowledge is becoming explicit, and it's going to be collective assets that are able to further automate development in AI, and we'll talk about the kind of ways that's done. But basically, at a high level, it can be used to improve the rules that you have in your org. It can help you improve the tools, and then it can also help improve the models. And so the last part I want to talk about with the open architecture is just one example, but I think the cool part about the open architecture is it allows you to integrate things that maybe you never thought of. So I didn't think of StackLock originally when I was thinking about kind of what this architecture might look like. But the cool thing is, by making it open, anyone can come and say, hey, this is a problem that I think should be solved, and anyone can go and put it in. And so you're able to basically extend the open server, the open architecture. It allows the ecosystem to form around it. And so CodeGate is an open source project from StackLock, so that's Craig's company, the CNCF Kubernetes founder that we talked about earlier. And what CodeGate does is it actually runs locally today, and what it will do is it will redact PII, protecting, like, basically don't send credentials, anonymize any PII about you, and then they do like dependency risk awareness so that malicious or deprecated open source packages that the model might suggest are not used. And so you can think of very out there kind of ways in which you're now going to see security concerns come up. So one might be like, oh, someone creates a fake library on the internet and pollutes it a ton, right? A library that has a name similar to a very common library, but pollutes the internet so much with that the model's being trained on it. And so then it suggests, like, I don't know, if popular library prime, right? So a variation of it, and you don't know, it looks exactly like it. And instead of it being the library you need, it just takes all of your code and sends it away to them, and they're able to now understand how your code works. And so it's just another vulnerability. So this kind of thing is super important, and it's one of, I think, many examples to come. Like, this is part of what I mean when I'm saying I don't feel like I have a fully clear sense of what the ultimate architecture will look like. This is just one example, but I think that's because, like, I don't think any single vendor is able to figure that out, right? I think this is not a firm problem. I think this is a market, this is an ecosystem that's gonna have to come together. And so we've had previous waves like this, whether it's like cloud native or kind of the analytics, big data kind of wave, or kind of earlier ones. I think what we're seeing is kind of increasing automation, right? A lot of what we've done in our careers is automate more and more of the coding we're doing, and that kind of models are the next step in that process. And so lastly, the one I've been kind of dancing around, the hardest one for me to kind of pin down, it feels like an elephant where I can feel different parts of it, but I haven't been able to fully sketch it, is this kind of open server. And so I know what it does today. Generally, what people use it for is they authenticate their users with the open server. They're usually proxying requests through that. They manage kind of the configuration, so each developer doesn't have to, like, set up their rules and tools and models themselves. It enables observability, right? Because all the traffic is going through. They're able to do different analyses and things like that and monitor things. They're kind of integrating context sources like a remote model context protocol server can be plugged in, and then often it's transforming the development data before you go put it into blob storage. And so what I think it's becoming is kind of a single source of truth for how development works in an organization. So a sort of natural language specification that makes how you build software legible, so rules, and then accessible tools to models. And so I think what it's going to be is like a living description within the organization of your code production process. So it's going to evolve with you. And I think as many of us, right, didn't go into engineering to write English or German. And many of us, don't want to spend our days reviewing English or German or whatever language you speak. I think it's going to require using the models quite a bit, right? Using the models to look at the development data to start to be like, oh, these are patterns, and then suggest it to the platform or our architects teams, and then they update things, and you'll need dependencies between the different rules, and you'll need dependencies between the tools, and there's some very interesting work going on to like figure out how that is right now. And so I think the parts to make this happen, at least in my mind, are kind of workflows, collaboration, and governance are kind of things that the server is also going to need. So the first one is like customization. So in the continuum world, we call them custom assistants. Other people call them modes and things like that. But basically, it's like taking all of the possible rules, tools, and models in your org or your team. How can you basically make them just the ones you need for specific workflows? And so we're seeing people create like audit assistants for auditing security vulnerabilities and creating a report for refactoring. We're seeing people create like plan assistants where they can are using them to create comprehensive product requirements, and then refactor assistants, right? And then kind of like a Unix philosophy kind of way, you can also plug these into each other. And so this just basically helps kind of constrain and focus the rules and tools so that the models can be more likely to achieve the task in the way that you want it done. I think the other part of the open server is kind of a collaboration, right? So in order to go from like implicit tribal knowledge to explicit collective knowledge, I think you have to work together to do that. And I think what you're gonna be largely doing is collaborating with people to basically improve your rules, tools, and models. And so what I've kind of termed runtime improvements are like basically helping in-context learning be more performant. So when you actually insert the context in the window. And so there's ways in which you can probably structure your rules in different ways and figure out what triggers actually insert them that will result in the model being more performant, kind of improving what tools you offer and how you integrate them and how you structure them and what triggers cause them to be inserted into the context. The dev data, right, that's streaming in can be actually used kind of in an observability fashion and transformed into rules, can be transformed into kind of better tools. And then in general, as the models get better, you're going to see better in-context learning. So if you use, for example, the latest Claude 4, generally people think it's better than Claude 3, and they're about a year apart from each other in terms of release. And so I think the general sense is Claude 5 will be better than Claude 4. And so compile time improvements would be like things like model training and fine-tuning. And so it's becoming more democratized and easier, but we're still a ways away from being able to actually pre-train our own models. But I do believe that we will end up doing that in organizations. One that's more accessible is optimizing via post-training, whether it's like supervised fine-tuning or reinforcement fine-tuning. There's things that I'm seeing today, like autocomplete models people are creating where they have 4 products and they fine-tune autocomplete models for each of those products and then do that on a weekly basis. Specializing for an organization, I've hit on this a couple times already, but what are the patterns and idioms that basically enable the model to give you suggestions that are more like what you'll merge, right? So in many ways, the goal is to minimize the edit distance between the suggestion and what you ultimately merge, and then more like domain-specific models. So if you have a programming language that's never seen the light of day, or you have maybe you're the only person who creates code for trains, right? Then maybe there's parts of kind of that software process and what that software ends up looking like that would benefit from models that are domain-specific for that. And the last one on the open server part is kind of enterprise requirements. So to roll this out in an organization like Siemens, for example, where it's complex, as we've seen today with the breadth of what y'all are working on in the open source and inner source world. But thinking about like, okay, how do you design this kind of open architecture and open server with security in mind, with the data sovereignty options that people want and need, with the permissions and controls and policy enforcements kind of the audit trails, the credential management, cost monitoring, performance monitoring. There's kind of lots of other dimensions that, as you think about what this open server and what this open architecture is going to look like, are going to need to be there in order for enterprises to roll it out. And so to close things out, looks like we'll have about 15 minutes for questions, or we can end early. Just want to give a couple words on why I believe the AI native open architecture matters. So first and foremost, I think it creates significant advantages that closed systems cannot match. So I think modularity, transparency, and interoperability are things that you don't get out of a closed system. And so I think Siemens is a great example, right? I was so excited when I read this blog post. The code.siemens.com team just put it out and I think they sent it to me, but they put it out first, right? And that was really cool to see that, like, they, in many ways, and I think they were the first time that I saw the word in-house ecosystem, right? And I think in many ways, they might have not been able to draw this architecture, maybe they could have, but I think that they were on to the right thing, and not only that, but they were using an open source client in the form of Continue and VS Code and making it available to y'all. And so I would say, from my perspective, Siemens is a pioneer on the open architecture, so I'm probably speaking to the people who already know and are teaching me, but I think the modularity, the transparency, and the interoperability are superior. And then if that doesn't convince you, right, then I think the open architecture is our way of amplifying ourselves as developers. So if you're keeping your data, you have the opportunity to further automate your development with models. If you give it away to other tools, then I think in the long run, and I don't know if it's a couple years like people in San Francisco where I live are saying, or it's a couple decades, or maybe it's a couple centuries, right? But we are on what appears to be a trajectory where we're going to further automate software development. And I mean, I would prefer to not live in a world where we, if it is even possible, which I might disagree with that premise, automate ourselves away with models. So with that, thank you so much for listening to me. If you want to get in touch, I'm Ty at continue.dev. Would love to chat with you.
Right. Thank you for your presentation. So I really like the phrase you said about like vibe coding eventually just becoming coding. So the question is like, shouldn't like a plugin eventually become an IDE? So like when you were talking about tools, right? Tools, the performance of the tools and like usability depends on how well those tools can actually like are integrated into your system. Like, can they, for example, I don't know, install like some kind of libraries, like install extensions, like connect to certain APIs and so on. And what I see, for example, from like Microsoft GitHub doing, right? They probably gonna train their models, like fine tune the models on like, and that's what OpenAI does with tools, right? Like they have like the reinforcement learning where they train instructions on the tools integration. And that's most likely what's going to happen also with Visual Studio Code and so on, that they just not going to have like plugins or like an additional thing. The thing will be like integrated in the sense of like a cursor, like where it's basically already an IDE with like vibe coding assistance in there. So like, do you think like, will you develop there, or like how long can you exist as a plugin? Because I think all IDEs will not have plugins, they will just have this as a basic functionality.
Great question. Yeah, I think we start from the premise of you have to meet developers where they're at, right? So I don't know if people have been to San Francisco, but there's self-driving cars, Waymos everywhere now. And I think if you look into how they developed, I think, like in the beginning, they really hoped that they would just be able to work, right, pretty quickly. It was going to be 2 years and they were going to drive. But what ended up happening is like you had to really meet the real world where it was at. You had to take into account the stop signs and the person on the pogo stick going in front of you and kind of all of the edge cases. And so what we found in most organizations is like they're not ready to move on from VS Code and JetBrains today, right? And that and the kind of long tail. So usually what we see is about somewhere between, depends on the org and what programming languages, but something like 60% say VS Code, 30% JetBrains, and say 10% long tail of other text editors and IDEs among developers there. And so kind of where we began, given that we started, is inside of existing IDEs. And the way that I kind of think about it, right, is there once was well, I guess there still is. I think y'all use it. Microsoft Edge, which had a precursor Explorer, right? And this thing called Google came along and is basically a website as a plugin to a browser, right? And what that enabled Google to do is then go eventually create Google Chrome, right? And so in many ways, I think the strategy that I believe in that's going to win, right? Betting on it with Continue, right, is that you need to start where developers are at. And as the models progress, as software development very much changes, I think you're going to build IDEs from scratch. But an IDE that is probably the most challenging piece of software that you could build. Maybe that's fighting words, but from my point of view, it's one of the hardest. And so I think you take that on one hand and you take that on the other hand, it's not clear how the software development is going to work in the future. And so I don't think you can go create your own IDE and have it be something that 10 years from now people are using, right? I don't even think, like maybe Zed is the one example, but they were building it for other purposes and are not now kind of retrofitting it. Like almost everybody's a fork of VS Code, right? Among the people who are building kind of their own IDEs today. And I just think you can't, for reasons we can talk about afterwards, I don't think you can fork today and end up beating, say, VS Code as it starts to actually integrate more of things. And so I think what will happen, right, given a lot of our jobs seem like it's going to be reviewing code and doing things more in German or English, and that a lot of it's going to be kind of monitoring these systems and figuring out how to improve them and stuff like that. I have a feeling that kind of the tools we need are going to be so different that it's no longer like the human writing the code as the main input, right? If you think about a text editor or an IDE today, it's first and foremost, the biggest thing is kind of this window of the code there, right? Maybe all we do, right, is exist at the abstraction layer of natural language, right? And similar to how very few people go down into assembly, maybe it ends up getting so good that you're not inside of the code at all, right? And like, I don't know how many people today are going down into assembly, like some probably are, but the vast majority of developers just exist at that higher abstraction layer. And so I think we'll create an IDE eventually, right, or an IDE-like tool, but the place to start is inside of existing editors is how we're thinking about it.
So to follow up on that, coding might not be the day job that we used to have it. So it's more like shaping the system or describing it. I think this is quite a challenge for some of us who just like coding. So because it's this tremendous Sudoku or however puzzle you want to have. I think there's also right now quite a clear separation between, let's say, product owner or people in the solution space and then those that build it. And as the building gets faster or tooled or better, how do you think that the tooling will close the gap between those? So these are mostly coding, enhancement, tooling, architecture parts, but how will the future look where those product solution people and the coder will get much closer in building things together?
Yeah, predictions are hard, but I'll attempt. So I think what's probably going to happen is you're just going to see the further democratization of development. So anyone that's like software adjacent today will become more of a developer and create software. I'm of the view that we're going to end up creating a lot more software. So I would probably say, if I made a prediction, the decade ahead, we're going to go from like 100 million people who are developers creating software to probably 1 billion, and that they're going to create a lot more software. I just think that a lot of reality has not been automated, and there's so much more that could be automated, and that basically makes organizations and people more efficient. And so I think there's going to be a lot more software. I think there's going to be a lot more developers. My view is, I think a lot of folks kind of, once again, where I live in San Francisco, are more like, it's going to happen in 1 to 2 years, this transition. I'm more of like the 1 to 2 decades person. And so I kind of view a lot of what people in the next couple of decades in this room are going to do is it's going to be still in the code, is my view. And that a lot of these new people are going to be the ones that, like, y'all are going to be like the assembly programmers, right, that are still there, right? And there's probably a ton of software that you're going to be frustrated with, unfortunately, that's being created by people who only partially understand it or don't understand it. And a lot of our jobs are going to remain in the code. I don't know, that's one piece of it. Like, I also like coding, and I mean, I view it kind of as an art and stuff like that. And so, I mean, I think often people will code in their free time, and I mean, if you're able to be as productive as other people, or if your boss is willing to let you, right, then, or like give the thumbs up on it, I think like coding by hand or manually will still be a part of the process. It's my hope, right, is that we just find ways that it's for like all the repetitive, the boring, like in the same way that like you write a shell script today to automate something that happens every day rather than you go manually doing it every day, that you just find the things like using this technology that you do want to automate, and then you get to focus on maybe the more creative work and the problem solving work. So when I use that word amplify, like that's my hope, right, is that we're going to automate the things we don't like, the things that are rote and repetitive, and that we'll have the opportunity to focus more of our jobs. Maybe that's aspirational, right, since in the world where there's lots of developers creating code they don't understand, maybe our jobs just become debugging their code, but we'll see. So it's a trend that I'm hoping to shape, but I'm very much not the person that's driving it, right, obviously, but hoping that we can shape it in a direction where all of us, and that's where I'm trying to go to conferences like this and get people excited about this potential, because like I don't think it is the case that, right, it's just going to happen, right? Like the developers in this room, in every room, are going to have a lot of choice. The ones who are already developers, let alone that are coming, right, to figure out like what do we like, what don't we like, what do we want to automate, what don't we want to automate, and stand up for ourselves and make that happen.
I've got a little question.
Sure.
To instruct, let's say, the coding environment and so on, you have the .continue folder, for example, where you can instruct the machine. Others are using an agent's MD file, and others are using, I don't know, this and that file. Is there some kind of standardization or alignment going on in that area, so that we only have to place one file to teach the machine how to work on our code?
Yeah, but my hope, right, that's a lot of what we're trying to do with Continue is drive standards, right? But I think standards tend to go more with the horizontally aligned systems, and with the vertically integrated closed solutions, they tend to believe that they're going to just automate all of software development themselves. And so I think as that proves to not be true and more people kind of move towards the horizontally aligned systems, which I think is already happening, right? Like people are letting MCP servers plug in, stuff like that, that we'll start to see hopefully a standardization of kind of the rules. It seems like most of it's going towards Markdown, and like I think there's probably going to be like some front matter for YAML triggers is generally where I think it's going, and then what are naming conventions. But like the pattern that I'm seeing generally with most people is like you start with one file in Markdown, right? And then so it's like your agent MD file, and then that gets too complex, so you split it out into multiple files, and like that gets overwhelming. So you like try to find a way to structure it with your code base, and then you're like, oh, I want to take this rule that I've created and like use it in this other code base. You're like, okay, let's create a Git repo for all of those, and then you run into problems of like how do you get those like files into there, right? Then you start to run into like a ton of issues once you get complex enough of like, if I change this rule, are there other rules that depend on it? And so where I see things going, for example, is maybe an open source project puts out their official rules, right? And then what you're able to do is leverage the power of natural language and models to be like, I want to use these rules, but change this, right? Or transform it in this way. And then the model runs and it makes those new rules out of it. And then when the official open source project updates their rules, it's like version 0.06 to 0.07, similar to like Dependabot today. Like you get a little notification like, hey, update your rules dependencies, and then it will update. It'll run the model again to rerun it, and then you'll be able to like keep it. And so that's just one example. I think there's going to need to be lots of those things, and so that's when I'm talking about this open architecture. Is I think there's going to be whole workflows around how do you manage rules and tools and models, and I think it's the opportunity to kind of build, in my view, like the next GitHub or GitLab, but layered on top of those existing solutions.
Thank you. Amazing talk. One of the best I ever heard, to be honest, around this topic. Really grounded. I like it. My question is not so much technical, but more because you mentioned you're from the Silicon Valley and all the crazy people, it seems, are right now there. Like, is there how do you interact? How do the people building stuff like you build interact? Is it like a community, or is it right now more like everybody's trying to keep a bit separate? Because of course there's also a lot of money involved. So just trying to get your impression here.
Yeah. So I don't know if I'd call them crazy, but you said that, I did not. So
I
they're
just
my
want to
friends. Yeah.
you really sound like you've really focused on this community aspect, which
Yeah.
I love.
Yeah.
But I could also imagine other people have other opinions.
Yeah, definitely, right? Like, I think in developer tools or infrastructure, as y'all probably have seen, you're almost always frenemies with people, right? And so there's ways in which, right, like you partner because it's beneficial at this point, but your competitors at that point. And so we kind of have the approach that like, the tide lifts all boats at the moment. And so we have demos on Friday. If any of you find yourself in San Francisco, let me know. You can come to our Friday demos and we invite people over. So like Klein is a great open source kind of agent product. Like they came over. And so folks that are more aligned with their business models and their things tend to, I would say, collaborate more in Vue community. But like, I think Red Hat, I saw them in the room, like we're a deep partner with Red Hat and IBM and Anthropic and OpenAI and Mistral. Like we're at the point at the moment that most people are trying to generate more revenue in San Francisco, and a great way to do that is like partner channels and things like that. And so I would say it's largely people kind of forming in a community, but I don't think enough, right? Like I think the standardization could go much further. I think instead of believing one vendor can solve everything, if we start to think about how can we have this be an ecosystem. So there isn't enough of that going on, but I think in the 2 years I've been there, I lived in Berlin for 4 years before I moved to San Francisco 2 years ago to start Continue, and I think it's drastically improved in terms of like people working together. And there's cool things like Inception Labs has these new awesome diffusion models called Mercury Coder that are insanely fast. And it's like, oh, they're now a partner of ours and they're like available in the autocomplete as soon as it drops, right? And so there's just such an advantage there where existing tools who've built their own autocomplete models aren't able to just immediately or not incentivized to just go at it. And so for the people who are willing to collaborate, like I think it allows the system to get exponentially better, right? Like overnight, we now have a great second closed source autocomplete model that just kind of appeared out of nowhere, right? Without us having to do work. And I think as people see that benefit, right, there's been a couple like YC startups recently that are training like apply models and bettings models and re-rankers. And instead of us doing that, right, like what many of the other kind of AI code assistants doing, they're doing it. And then we can offer to Siemens and say, here's a few different options. Like this one's on-prem, this one's SaaS only, and y'all are able to like decide which ones you use or don't use. So I think the open ecosystem will win for that reason.
Perfect final word. Thanks a lot, Ty.
Thank you.